Welcome to episode number 7 of the Dan Time Podcast. Hey, I'm your host, Dan McArdle. Hey, thanks for checking out the show. Whether this is your first listen or you've been here all along, I appreciate you making Dan Time a part of your podcast rotation. So how'd your team do last weekend? Who are you pulling for? Are you playing fantasy football? Are you 3-0? Or maybe, like me, you're 0-3? Look, it's an exciting time of the year for sports fans, whether you're celebrating, you're on the edge of your seat, or you're pulling your hair out and you're wondering what is going on. I brought on today's guest with football season in mind. Ladies and gentlemen, Vic Penn joins Dan Time today, and he's got a Dan story to tell. Vic played opposite Peyton Manning, opposite Drew Brees. He was a redshirt freshman quarterback at the University of South Carolina during the 1997 season. He then transferred to junior college and to the University of Central Florida, where he would set passing records and cement his legacy. This is a guy who knows what it's like to compete head-to-head with the best of the best. He has thrived in hostile environments. He's been the guy who was too small, yet still figured out how to study defenses and keep his teams in games until time expired. He's a student of the game, and Vic knows what it's like on the field and in life to get back up when you get knocked down. As is the case in life, things didn't always go perfectly for Vic. You'll hear in this conversation, he's still a guy who knows how to put it all in perspective, and he knows what it's all about. It's about relationships. Today, Vic is thankful for the various stops that he made, whether he wanted to be there or not, because now he's got a rich network of friends. In the 1999 season, Vic Penn was among the best quarterbacks in all of Division I football. Vic finished 6th in the nation in total plays in 1999 and 10th in pass attempts. Vic and I became friends about 11 years ago. When I met him, he had the presence of a guy who had been places and faced challenges. Well, I'm excited to bring this conversation to you today, so sit back, buckle up, enjoy the ride. If you remember these days, take a trip down memory lane, and it is my pleasure to bring to you guys Vic Penn. Vic, how is it going, man? I'm so glad to have you here. I understand that you've got a very unique Dan story to tell.
Absolutely. Dan, thanks for having me on the show. It's a pleasure, and I'm honored. My Dan Marino story is I grew up in Miami, Florida. And, of course, I was a quarterback. And I didn't play quarterback till high school, but I grew up watching Dan Marino play for the Dolphins, and I emulated him outside when I'm playing with the kids in the street of Miami. And Dan Marino was always known for having a quick release. And when I copied his style of play, too ended up being known for having a quick release. And I really didn't know why I had a quick release or why Dan had a quick release. It was not until my little brother was at a karate lesson where I kind of put two and two together. And the karate instructor came up to me and he said, look, the karate punch is thrown from the shoulder. And in order to throw the karate punch from the shoulder, you have to, as a right hand punch, you have to step to the left and throw the punch from the shoulder. Because if you step towards your opponent or towards your receiver, if you're playing quarterback, you can't really throw it from your shoulder and step forward. So the quarterback quick release was a step to the left. And if you watch Marino highlights, you'll see him. He doesn't step towards the receiver. He steps to his left, rotates his hips, and throws the ball from his shoulder just about 9 out of 10 times. And that's how the quick release is very similar to the karate punch. When I played high school football in Miami at Miami Senior High, it was time for me to be recruited by the colleges. And my dad and I had to separate ourselves from every regular highlight tape. So we made a highlight tape called the quick release. And in that highlight tape, I compared myself to Marino and showed some Marino highlights and then showed some of my highlights that were the step to the left and throw from the shoulder, which is how you develop the quick release. But you can't step towards the receiver and towards front and throw from the shoulder. You have to come over top like a traditional quarterback would come over the top as he's stepping towards the receiver. So it was the karate punch motion. It's the step to the left and the throw from the shoulder, which how the quick release was really demonstrated to me. And we sent that video to every Division I college in the United States of America. And thankfully, I received a few scholarship offers before selecting to take the scholarship from the University of South Carolina Gamecocks, and that's how I got my scholarship to Division I football, is through comparing myself to Dan Marino.
What a great story. Did you get a chance to see Marino play live? Did you go to any ball games as a
I went to just about every home game when the Dolphins were playing. My dad was childhood friends with Stuart Weinstein, who was head of security for the Dolphins. I think he still is head of security for the Dolphins, but back in the Shula years, in the Marino years, he always had tickets for us. We sat in the club seating, so I saw Dan play many times, and he was definitely my favorite player. Sorry he never won a Super Bowl, but he didn't really always have the team around him. But he threw the ball like nobody I've ever seen to this day.
well, he's obviously one of my favorite quarterbacks, and some of those seasons, even late in his career, he was so competitive, but his defense didn't always hold leads for him, and some other things out of his control, but still an all-time legend.
Absolutely. He never
Vic,
had a running game either.
right. Now, growing up, I heard that you played a lot of baseball through all your childhood years, early teenage years. It really wasn't until you hit high school that you tried out for organized football, and that was the first time that you played.
That's true. My dad wouldn't let me play organized football until I got to high school. So I primarily played baseball. And I recommend this to the quarterbacks if I train them these days. I always recommend at a young age that they play the position of catcher, because a catcher, one, will toughen you up. And because it's a tough position and you're involved every play. If you're planning on playing quarterback, I always recommend a year or two of catcher. Now, I primarily played shortstop, but I did spend a couple years playing catcher, and catcher has that similar quick release style. When the runner's stealing second, that catcher has to pop up and throw from his shoulder, and the only way he can do that, if you watch him, is the karate motion. It's the step to the left, and it's the throw the runner out at second. So I did play baseball my entire childhood, primarily with shortstop, but I did pitch a little and I played catcher a little. And I think that toughened me up to play quarterback, the catcher position. And I'm thankful I did that. But I didn't play organized football until high school. My dad wouldn't let me. He just said, and there were other kids that were playing, and a lot of them got hurt. A lot of them tore their knees at young ages. Some of them, broke their bones, and were injured severely at a young age. So I'm very thankful that he held me out of football until high school. And it wasn't until high school where I finally played the quarterback position in a league in an organized setting.
And I mean, Miami-Dade County, this is not just any district. This is a hotbed of talent. I think your dad had some legitimate concerns about
Absolutely.
about you playing, but you got right into the lion's den, and probably some great exposure looking ahead to your college career and some offers that you would receive. Your high school experience. I mean, I know a lot of players remember exact plays and the whole narrative of entire games. Do all your high school games still stand out to you really vividly?
Some of them do. I played. I went to the local high school at first, Southwest Miami High, and I played JV as a freshman, and then I started varsity as a sophomore, and played the whole season there. And we got our butts whipped. I think we won one game, and it was watching and reading the newspaper and seeing the news every Saturday or Friday night. Miami High had a quarterback by the name of Wilkie Perez, and he was getting all the hype. And I said, I need to get on that guy's level. So and he ended up signing a scholarship to West Virginia University. I was still coming out of 10th grade, about to be into the 11th grade. So middle 10th grade, before spring practice, I transferred over to Miami High to play football, which was a scary process because I didn't have my childhood friends there any longer. It was primarily Hispanic and African American. I think I was the only white guy, if you will, in that school. And I changed my mind a couple different times. And I ended up saying to my dad, "No, I gotta go." And this was before the transfer portal, so we had to rent an apartment in Miami High's address so that I could have a legal address to use to be able to make the transfer. So the great dad that my dad was, he actually went out and got an apartment there in Miami Heights district, and we were able to use that address. Of course, the other school hated it because I had to play them twice the next 2 years. But before spring practice of my 10th grade year, I transferred to Miami High, made a lot of great friends, played the spring game there and spring practice at Miami High, and then played 2 more years out at Miami High. And my senior year, we went 10-0. We were number one ranked in the state and number 9 in the nation by USA Today. And we were blowing everybody out. And we lost to Miami Killian, who had the number one rated defense in the state of Florida at the time, in the first round of the playoffs. We had Cedric Irvin, our running back, who ended up playing for Michigan State and the Detroit Lions. And we drove the length of the field under 2 minutes. On our final possession, we were down by 6. We were down by 5. A touchdown would have won the game without the extra point. We drove to their 1 yard line under 2 minutes in our 2 minute drill, and they stopped said 4 times in a row from the 1 yard line. Killian's D had a goal line stand, stopped us 4 times in a row, and that is one of the toughest losses I've ever experienced as an athlete, period, because we drove the length of the field under 2 minutes. We were prime, set, and ready to take the win. We gave it to said 4 times, and they had a tremendous goal line stand. They stopped us 4 plays in a row from the one, and we lost. And the rest is history. But that game stands out. I'll never forget it. I still have the VHS tape there. I watch it from time to time, hoping Ced would get in there at one time, but he just falls just a hair short. And Ced went on to play for Michigan State, became one of their all-time leading running backs, and then played for the Detroit Lions. He went on to coach with Nick Saban, because Saban was the coach at Michigan State then. At Alabama, he was a key coach in their undefeated years. He was a running backs coach. So that Miami Killian game, the first round of the playoffs, 4 stops from the one, something I'll never forget.
Do you think that some of those tough losses, almost inexplicable losses sometimes, where you just replay it over and over, do you think that at a young age you were being primed to deal with situations when you're playing in the SEC for an SEC school and then later for an independent, and almost pulling off an upset and not quite getting there? But do you think those early experiences helped you handle some of the games that you just couldn't?
No.
It never got any easier.
Never got any easier. I had some tough losses in college, Georgia Tech, Georgia, Auburn, where we were neck and neck to the final minute, final seconds, some of those games, and they're all tough. But I wouldn't change a thing. Everything happens for a reason, and you look back and sure, you would have liked to won some of those games, but even though they were close losses, it still has an impact. And, football in general, has a way to develop discipline and character and integrity and things like that. So I'm thankful for the way it turned out. Now, I really wanted to play for Florida State coming out of high school. I could have used those extra 3 or 4 games in the playoffs to maybe solidify that scholarship to Florida State, because they were hot on me. But we lost first round. I ended up going to South Carolina, but I had some great coaching there. John Reeves was my quarterback coach, and Coach Reeves held the NCAA passing yardage record as a Florida Gator quarterback in the early 70s for some 30 years before Danny Werfel, another Gator, ended up beating him. And I had tremendous coaching from Coach Reeves there as my quarterback coach. And then when I went to UCF, I ended up having Mike Kruzak, a former Pittsburgh Steeler, Terry Bradshaw's backup, as my quarterback coach for 2 years and head coach at UCF. So between the two, I really got some phenomenal coaching at the quarterback position. And as I watch quarterbacks today, sometimes I'm just thinking, man, these guys just don't know what they're doing at times, because it wasn't really until Coach Kruzak and Coach Reeves where I really learned the game of quarterback and how to look at a defense and kind of eliminate receivers based on what they were going to do post snap of the football. I was able to see, and by game film watching, I was able to know what defense they were going to be in by a couple of key indicators that would give it away every time. They could look like they were in cover two, but number 42 on the defense would give it away when he was a half a yard to the right or a half a yard to the left meant they were going to drop into a cover three. So even though they were showing one defense, I was able to get out, audible, change the play at the line of scrimmage into a play that would successfully have a chance to beat the defense they were going to drop into. So I learned the quarterback position in a whole different light from these guys. And for that, I'm very thankful that it ended up the way that it ended up because I really learned the quarterback position very well.
Now, at South Carolina, when you sign with the Gamecocks, you're not sure when you're going to be the starting quarterback. At first, are you third on the depth chart?
Right. I was redshirted my freshman year, but I was still traveled with the teams as a third string quarterback. Would be able to play in an emergency, but I redshirted my first year as a freshman.
So Peyton Manning's final season, final home game,
Yes.
you're the backup. Just take me through, let's just say that morning, you're waking up in the team hotel. I guess you always prepare as if you're going to come into the game, but what's it like when you're in Knoxville and you guys, you know that you're about to be, whether on the field or on the sideline, there's going to be 100,000+ people there.
Right.
Are you ready to be the starter, or are you just,
Yes, yes and no. Yes and no. And let me tell you why. It was Peyton Manning's final home game. At the time, they had a record crowd, 110,000 people. And my job as the backup was to signal the plays into our starter, Anthony Wright. And I was very involved in the game as it's getting the plays down from our offensive coordinator to the headphones and then signaling them in to Anthony. But there was no way I was going to play in this game. Anthony was a phenomenal athlete, phenomenal player. I think he played 11 years in the NFL after that, made some starts for the Cowboys and Baltimore Ravens. But I didn't have my ankles taped because I was going to get them taped at halftime because I knew the only time I was going to play was either if we were blowing them out or more likely because of Peyton Manning, them blowing us out. And I had only played in mop-up duty up until that point. I was a redshirt freshman. And so I'm standing there. It was pouring rain, too. It was another element that I had to deal with because it was just a rainy day, Peyton's final home game. And the end of the first or the very beginning of the second quarter, Anthony tears about every ligament in his knee and is out for the season. So I had to go in without my ankles taped. And it wasn't a big deal, but you asked the question if I was prepared. I was prepared mentally and ready, but I remember not having my ankles taped because I just wasn't going to play until the fourth quarter. So I went out there the first half, played the second quarter. They ended up beating us 22-7. But I was able to throw a touchdown pass in the corner of the end zone. But that was my first touchdown pass, happened to come against Peyton Manning's final home game, which is something that I'll always remember in Knoxville, in Neyland Stadium. And I did get my ankles taped at halftime.
And, it's not some small footnote that you avoided the shutout. I mean, that score could have been 22-0 in the annals of history. And then you turn around and start against, is it Florida next?
It was the defending national champion Florida Gators because they had won it in '96.
And now Tennessee goes on to win the SEC title that year, and then the next year I think they won the national championship.
That's correct. When T. Martin came in after Peyton, and then they won it the following year. My first ever start was back home at Williams-Brice Stadium in South Carolina against the defending national champion, Spurrier-led Florida Gators. And that was a close one until the fourth quarter. It was 14-14. I had thrown a touchdown pass and I was having a pretty darn good game. And it was 14-14, the start of the fourth. They ended up beating us, I think, 42-21 because Fred Taylor, their running back, ran for 200+ yards in the fourth quarter alone. And I ended up throwing a second touchdown pass in the fourth, but we lost, I think, 42-21 or something like that. And it was a great game, great experience. Took a lot of hits in both games. Playing against those two powerhouse SEC schools as a redshirt freshman was something I'll never forget. A lot of fun. But I got beat up and bruised pretty badly. But I was a little guy. I mean, I was only 6'1", 175 at the time, which is tremendously small for a quarterback at the SEC. But I then went on to play against Clemson after that, and they beat us also. But it was a good game. Made a lot of great plays, had some unfortunate turnovers that cost us. But at the conclusion of that season, I was named the 1997 All-SEC Freshman Quarterback of the Year. which at the time I really didn't think too much of. But looking back on it, it was an honor that not a lot of players, not a lot of quarterbacks are able to obtain. And I look back and I'm very thankful for it and the way that it turned out. It was a great experience in South Carolina. Love the Gamecocks to death to this day. Their fan base is tremendous. I mean, they sold out every game, years in advance. And that Clemson South Carolina game is rivalry week. It's a great rivalry, and it's on TV, ESPN. Usually it was a night game, and great game. You can still find it on YouTube, and memories that I always remember.
Oh, and I also want to go back. This is kind of an interesting statistic from the Tennessee game. Now, Peyton, probably in the second half, wasn't throwing the ball a lot compared to the first half, but she actually had more completions than Peyton Manning in that game.
Yeah, I remember there was an article in the Atlanta paper that my aunt sent me because they were living in Atlanta at the time that said something like, it wasn't Peyton Manning, it wasn't Anthony Wright, it was Vic Penn who stole the show or something of that nature.
Yeah, you had more completions and a better completion percentage.
Well, that I didn't know. I appreciate you telling me that. But again, it was raining. It was raining. He did play the whole game because it was close. It was like 16-0, and then I think they kicked two more field goals, made it 22 later in the game. But it was a tight game. I think most of the game it was 9-0 Tennessee, and then I threw the touchdown in the fourth quarter, made it 22-7. I went 9 for 16, 110 yards. I think is accurate. 9 for 16, 110 yards. They didn't let me throw as often as I would have liked. Again, it was raining. I was new. I was just a redshirt freshman. I had just some mop-up experience. I had won the spring game the year before, South Carolina spring game against Anthony, when they split up the teams and have our spring game. And I was playing well, but they put me in a lot of third and long situations and then tried to throw. Run the ball on first, run the ball on second. Next thing I know, it's 3rd and 12 and I got to come up with a play. And that was difficult, but it was great experience and it toughened me up. And again, I was named All SEC freshman quarterback, which, if you remember Jesse Palmer for the Gators, he was another freshman that year that came in and played quite a bit. So he's my claim to fame because he went on, he's ESPN, The Bachelor, and did all these shows after that. But Jesse Palmer was my competition for the SEC, and I was able to get the award, and just great memories.
Well, it's well earned, and those of you listening who are around our age and you remember Vic Penn, do yourself a favor, go back on YouTube, relive some of these old SEC matchups that Vic was involved in. If you're a young guy and you want to see Vic, I was going to mention this, just your footwork. Do you think that your size at that time actually helped you scramble and evade would-be tacklers?
I was always a student of the game, and I was always very fast, even as a kid. When playing baseball, if I got to first base, I was on third because I was stealing second, stealing third. I was always very fast, but I was always paid attention to mechanics, and I always knew that mechanics were going to help my accuracy. So being small, a 6'1", 175, the first thing I would tell them is that it doesn't bother me. I have more room on the airplane flights. I would look around and I'd see all these guys and they're crammed up in their seats and they've got no room. And I'm sitting there relaxed, kicking back. And so that was a plus. But when I went to UCF, I had to quote unquote fill the shoes of Dante Culpepper, who was UCF's quarterback for 4 years. And he had just got drafted by the Minnesota Vikings. And I was the very next quarterback to take his place at UCF. I had a stint in Garden City, Kansas, because when you transferred back then, D1 to D1, you had to sit out a year. I don't think that's the rule anymore. But so I went to a junior college after South Carolina and played a season in Garden City, Kansas Junior College, the Bronc Busters, and that was tough. That was tough, playing in front of 100,000 people in the SEC on television, to going out to Kansas, playing in front of 100 people who were all parents, and in a high school field at nighttime. Very difficult to get up for those games, but we went 9-3, won our bowl game, and great experience. I still made great friends and great coaches out there also, and it was a tremendous experience. And I give it to Coach Jim Gush, who actually found me. He said, I was going to go transfer to another Division I school, and he said, why don't you come out here, play for a year in junior college? You get to take your 5 recruiting trips, get re-recruited again, just like if you're coming out of high school. This way you don't have to sit out a year and you get to play a year. So he contacted me, and he was the only one to contact me. And I'm still great friends with Coach Gush today. And that's how I ended up signing a scholarship to UCF coming out of Garden City, Kansas for a year, junior college.
I could see where you wanted to get back to a prime time, high exposure. Well, I guess they didn't call them Power Five schools at that time, but
Absolutely.
wanted to get back into that environment.
Yeah.
Vic, you must have seen that schedule. I don't know how many years in advance the schedules were released back then, but Purdue, Florida, Georgia Tech, Georgia. I mean, bang, bang, bang. Did you just look at that and eyes
That's what sold me, yes.
wide open, like, I got to get it. I got to be a part of that?
Well, being out in Kansas at that young of an age and getting a call from UCF, at first I wanted to come back to my neck of the woods. And I'm from Miami. They play in Orlando. And I had a lot of friends that were going to UCF at the time. And I knew that they didn't have a quarterback that hadn't played other than Culpepper there. And I knew that it was going to be top news of who was going to replace Culpepper at UCF. So when they called me up, Coach Scott Fountain was the first one to call me, and they told me Purdue, it was against Drew Brees, Florida, Georgia Tech, and then Georgia. Then we had some home games that were Louisiana Tech and good teams, but then we had Auburn, mid-season, and Bowling Green, and some real, I think the schedule, the first 4 games were rated at the time the toughest in the nation. All 4 teams were ranked, Purdue, Florida, Georgia Tech, and Georgia. And we lost all 4, but we almost beat Georgia. We lost 24-23. But what a great experience it was. And to be able to learn under Mike Kruzak, who was Terry Bradshaw's backup as a Steeler, has 2 Super Bowl rings, to learn the quarterback position from him changed the way I played quarterback completely. We didn't have the freedom to audible. We were required to audible because he said to me, Vic, look, I can only be right a certain amount of times when I call plays. There's going to be times where you come up to the line of scrimmage and I've called a play and they come out in the defense that's going to stop that play. I need you to be able to recognize that, get out of that play, and get into a play that has a chance of being successful. So we were required to audible based on what we saw pre-snap at the line of scrimmage. And that was just a completely different way to play the game. I was able to eliminate receiver number 1, receiver number 2, because the traditional way of teaching quarterbacks is to drop back, look at number 1, look at number 2, look at number 3. If he's not there, come down to 4, right? And he taught us, look, eliminate 1 and 2 based off, we knew they were going to be covered pre-snap because they were dropping into a zone or a specific defense that was going to have number 1 and 2 covered, and hit your 5th step and come right to number 3 because number 3 is the one that's going to be open. So and Marino was like that too. Old Dan, he was able to eliminate receivers at the line of scrimmage based off what he knew the coverage was going to indicate and what they were going to drop into. So that helped with accuracy because when you drop back and you hit your 5th step and you're not worried about 1 and 2 because you know they're going to be covered, and you're able to, in one fluid motion, hit your step, come up, and throw right to number 3 in one fluid motion. It was all about rhythm. Your accuracy is much better when you know what you're doing. And I compare it to a shortstop playing baseball. The shortstop's there, and he knows that there's no runners on. There's 1 out. If a ground ball gets hit to him, he's going to field it, take a hop, step, and a jump, and throw it over to first. And 10 times out of 10, that ball gets hit to him. He fields it. He takes his nice hop, step, and a jump. He's nice rhythm, nice fluid motion, and he throws his strike right over to first base. You never see him stop and wonder and look and move his feet to the right and then try to throw to first. It's that one fluid consecutive motion that's able to be accurate to that throw at first because he knows what he's going to do before that ball is hit. He knows there's no outs. He knows that there's nobody on base. If a ground ball is hit to me, I'm throwing right to first. And sure enough, and the quarterback's the same way. So when you eliminate receiver 1 and 2, you hit your 5th step in a nice one fluid motion, are able to come to number 3 or 4 because you know that 1 or 2 are going to be covered. The mind and the smarts of the quarterback and the preparation of the quarterback helps with accuracy along with the fundamentals, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And Krusek, he saw something in you. I read this in the Orlando Sentinel. I think it was before the start of the 99 season. Quote, Vic's already been in battle, speaking of your year at South Carolina. He already knows how to prepare for big opponents. So he saw something that he liked in you and probably knew that you were going to fit in well with their system. And I think following in the footsteps of Culpepper, you probably had the benefit of not being around him and not shadowing him but just kind of coming in and being aware of him, but not having some intimidation factor.
Right. Well, first of all, he was 6'4", 260. I was 6'1", 175. So there was quite a big difference there. But I've met him a couple of times and spoken with him a few times. But like you said, he was drafted and on to Minnesota by the time I ended up at UCF. So he wasn't there on campus, as an intimidation factor. So you're exactly right. He was gone. I came in. I wasn't behind him at UCF for 2 years. I came in from another school. So you're exactly right. But I still had to answer all the questions, and everybody, even after we played Purdue, our first game of the season against Drew Brees, the questions were, were you thinking about Culpepper? Were you, Culpepper this, Culpepper that? And I remember saying, listen, Dante's gone. He's never going to be here again. Y'all need to move on. But still an honor to have followed such a great athlete and a great player. And he had a great NFL career also. Several Pro Bowls. Got to play with Randy Moss and Chris Carter there at Minnesota. And he would always call me, throughout the season and give me some words of encouragement and tell me I was playing well and doing things like that. And he was a very strong supporter. But yeah, to answer your question, he wasn't there. I wasn't there as his backup for 4 years or 2 years. I came in from a different school, so he wasn't there on top of me when I got to UCF.
Well, that's a really nice side note, though, that he actually is still keeping up, following up with the Golden Knights and who their quarterback is, and he's reaching out to you. I mean, I know that goes on a little bit nowadays, but you figure some guys they're off to the NFL and
right. Well, our starting receiver Kenny Clark is his first cousin. When I played at UCF, our starting receiver, the Z position, was Kenny Clark, and he was Dante's first cousin from Ocala, Vanguard in Florida. So he still had ties, but he's still a big supporter even to these days of UCF football. He still gives back. He's still part of the Letterman's Club and things of that nature. So Dante's just a great guy. He's a tremendous athlete, tremendous size, gift, and ability. He runs, I think back then, a 4.5, 4.4, 4.5 40 at his size. He looks like a defensive end playing the quarterback position. So they asked me how I was going to fill his shoes because he was so much bigger than me. I said, I have to let my toenails grow. He triples me in size.
Now, I might jump around a little bit in this 1999 season, but before I forget, you set a record that year that stood for close to 25 years, I think, until Plumlee broke the single-game rushing record. You ran for 122 yards versus Middle Tennessee State.
Yep, that was, at the time I didn't know, all right? So Coach Cruz saw a hole in their defense, and he called some quarterback draws in that game. And I broke one for like 55 in the first quarter or second quarter. And then in the second half, I broke another one for 50 some odd yards. And then I had some other scrambles in there. And I totaled 122. And I remember being on the plane going home. It was at Middle Tennessee State on turf. And Coach Cruz came back to me while I was on the plane in flight. And he showed me the stat that I rushed for 122 yards. And I was the first quarterback in UCF history to ever rush for over 100 yards in the game, 122. Dante only had 98. And so I was the first UCF quarterback to rush for over 100 yards. And then I held the record for 122 yards for, like you said, 25 some odd years until last season. Plumlee broke the record. I think he hit 176. It was fun because every year, every time a quarterback got close, and there were a couple that got close, 121, 120, 117. I would always get text messages from my friends. He's going to do it. He's going to do it. And they'd always fall short. This time I'm sitting there on Saturday. I forget what I was doing, but I got a text message from my buddy Chris Askew, who was our long snapper at UCF at the time. And he said, Plumlee's got 156 in the first half. I said, wow, it's over. And it was 20 some odd years. And it was a great record. And always remember it. But that son of a gun beat me, and I think he ended up with 176. And tremendous athlete, though, great runner, and I think he's hurt right now. He's not playing this year. He played the first couple games, but got hurt. But the record did get beaten last season, but I did have it for 20 some odd years.
And speaking of all-time records with Central Florida, and this is, folks, you got to remember that the 2000 season, which we'll get to, the last 6 games of the year he didn't play due to injury.
Right.
But Vic, you're number 9 on the all-time passing list for the Golden Knights. And if you fill out that whole 2000 season, if you're there 98, I mean, my gosh, you're probably in the top 5.
Well, I appreciate that, and you're right. I only played a season and a half at UCF, while the other quarterbacks are playing 3-4 years. But because of Kruzak and because of the coaching in that 1999 year, I was able to finish 12th in the nation in total offense. And we had that schedule: Purdue, Florida, Georgia Tech, Georgia, Auburn, Bowling Green, Louisiana Tech, Middle Tennessee State. We had a pretty good schedule. And at the time, like, again, it didn't really seem that big of a deal. But when I go back and look at the list that of the top 50,
Oh, yeah.
like Drew Brees, number 3. I was number 1 in Florida, beat out Doug Johnson at Florida and Chris Winkie at Florida State. And then the greatest of all time, Tom Brady, finished 44th that year in total offense at Michigan. So to be on the same list as those guys didn't really mean much at the time because you're just young and not really thinking it. But as I look back and see all these great names, Michael Vick on that list, and a lot of great quarterbacks, Chad Pennington and Drew Brees, and it's an honor to be part of that list and be associated with some great quarterbacks and probably the greatest of all time in Tom Brady.
Well, and another name that's on this list, Doug Johnson from Florida, and you competed against him in that game in 1999. Another quote, Vic, that I just loved it when I saw this. I was doing some research. This is from the Orlando Sentinel. I think it might be a photo caption. I wasn't intimidated by them one bit. And that's speaking of the Florida Gators or being at the Swamp. Take me through that day. I mean, do you have jitters when you're getting ready for a game like that, or are you just
Absolutely, because the week before we had played Purdue and they beat me up pretty good, and I remember I couldn't bend my legs until midweek. My thighs were so bruised. My jaw felt like it was up in my ear. I had to warm up my jaw every morning just to be able to talk. And then I said, "Great, now I'm playing the Gators this week."
no relief?
I remember sitting in my locker before the game. I was well prepared and confident, but the jitters were so bad, the stomach butterflies, that I just remember sitting in my locker after warm-ups, after everything, and just praying like you wouldn't believe, asking God to just protect me and help me this game. And I remember just praying all the way up until I went out on the field. But when I got out there on the field in the Swamp, it's so electrifying and it's so loud that it's almost like you're on some kind of a drug because your adrenaline comes up so high. And I had one of my best games of my career. I think I threw 36 completions of 55 attempts, had several drops in that game, but I threw for 379 and 3 touchdowns. We ended up losing, but I had a great game, and I attribute that to the crowd, because the crowd, it sounds like it's so loud that you almost are like a machine out there. And I wasn't expecting that. When the adrenaline kicked in out there, the butterflies went away, and I had one of my greatest games against those Florida Gators.
Now, do you and like the opposing quarterback, whether it's Brees or Doug Johnson or Peyton, are you guys having a post game moment? Are you helmet to helmet saying, "Hey, man, good game"?
Absolutely. I was able to shake hands with Peyton after that game, and Drew Brees was actually my favorite because Drew Brees came up to me and we shook hands, and he said, "You're a great quarterback." And I said, "Well, so are you." And that was it. And he told me I was a great quarterback and went on to be one of the all-time greats.
And Purdue, actually, they were interested in you. I think you were, like you said,
Yes.
you were really looking at Florida State for a while there, but Purdue did show some interest.
Purdue came down to Miami High and watched me, their coaching staff. 2 coaches came down and watched me practice one day. And they sent me a letter about a week later that said, "Vic, we think you could throw the ball as well as anybody we've seen, but we think you're too small. We don't think you can take the pounding of the college football beatings that the quarterbacks take." And they didn't offer me a scholarship, but they did send me a letter. They were hot on me for a while. They came down and visited with me in Miami, but they told me I was too small. It wasn't my height, it was my weight. I mean, Drew Brees is always known as a small quarterback, but he was 225 pounds, and I was 175 pounds. And in high school, probably 169, 170. I was really skinny, and I ended up signing with the Gamecocks, and the rest is history. I think Drew Brees had signed the year before me. I don't think he came out the same year I did. I could be wrong, but in the event that I'm wrong and they did sign Drew Brees in lieu of me, I think they made the right decision.
Well, that is, I mean, something else though that he said, "Hey, I think you're a great quarterback," and I've always respected Breeze. Everybody's got their favorite NFL quarterbacks. He's never been my favorite, but I just always respect the guy.
Just a good guy, and when I nothing against anybody else. I'm not saying that. I shook hands with Peyton. He said good game, but when Drew Brees looked me in the eye, shook my hand, and was very respectful of me. He said, "You're a great quarterback." I said, "So are you." And we shook hands, and then true story, we mingled around the field again, like everybody does, and then we ran smack into each other again, and we shook hands a second time. He said, "You're a great quarterback." We laughed, and I said, "So are you," and we shook hands again. So we actually shook hands twice after that game because we really just ran back smack into each other after the crowd of people come on the field and everybody's kind of mingling around. So that's a great story, and I always cherish that. But I always pulled for Breeze. Even before that, I looked up to him. Like he said, he's always been a class act and a great quarterback. And I'm very happy that his career turned out the way it did, and he ended up winning the Super Bowl because he well deserved a Super Bowl because he was one of the hardest working and toughest quarterbacks, both physically and mentally, that ever played the game.
Absolutely. Vic, one thing I just wanted to speak about with these big time opponents, you guys are going in, you kind of have an interesting perspective as feeling like we know we can hang with these guys. We're not going to be favored in any of these games, so we're not supposed to win, but we know we can hang with them. And then you nearly pull off some upsets. The Auburn game, I think a lot of people forget that you're holding a slim lead. It's a pretty defensive game, I guess. What was it, 6-3?
No, it was 10-7. It was 10-7, our lead most of the game, and we dominated on offense. I think I threw 300, close to 400 yards in that one. We just couldn't get the ball in the end zone, but we moved the ball from 20 to 20 the whole game. We managed the clock. We controlled the time of possession. I had another great game there. Auburn's at the time away locker rooms were the worst away locker rooms in all the schools I've ever played against. It was very tiny. They had no air condition. You were in a full-blown sweat. Your jersey was soaking wet by the time you even went out to warm up. And I'm pretty sure they did it intentionally. Now, they revamped everything since then. But back then, they had a very, very tiny locker room. We got 50 some odd guys that are huge coming into this locker room, and no air condition. There's no room to move. You're up on top of each other, tiny little lockers. Their away locker rooms were the worst, and I think they did it intentionally, which is smart, in my opinion, if you're going to take advantage of everything you can.
That's really unacceptable.
I mean, most of these places have nice, they're not the home locker room. That's beautiful in most schools, including South Carolina's. I've never been in South Carolina's away locker room, but I can definitely say that Auburn's was the worst in the SEC for sure because it was just pitiful. We were winning that game 10-7 up until the last couple of minutes of the fourth, and they scored 2 touchdowns or 1 touchdown, I forget, and ended up beating us. And the next year, 2000, Georgia Tech, same way. Final 2 minutes, we're up in that game, and they ended up beating us. But later that season, we ended up beating Alabama on their homecoming. I didn't play that game, but Ryan Schneider came in when I got hurt. But I was still very much involved in that game and signaling to Snyder and helping Snyder. And Ryan Schneider turned out to be one of UCF's greatest quarterbacks. So still a good friend of mine today. He's coaching down there in Cocoa Beach High School, and he's doing a tremendous job. But yeah, I mean, having lived up here in Panhandle, Florida, and with all the Alabama fans, they can roll tide all they want, but I'm always able to say to the day I die that I was on the team that beat Alabama on their homecoming. So I'm always pulling for Alabama because the better they do, the better that legacy ever it becomes. To be able to say that we beat Alabama on their turf, at home, on their homecoming is something I'll never forget.
Yeah, I mean, and you can never take that away from anybody, whether it's this Nick Saban era, which very few teams, non-conference teams, have had those moments. But anytime you beat Alabama at Bryant-Denny Stadium, Vic, what is it like when you get back on the bus versus the games where you almost pulled off the upset? I was going to ask about how guys treat each other when you lost a real close one. Is it quiet? Is anybody getting on to anybody? Is anybody saying, "Hey, man, you should have made that play," or is it?
The Georgia game, we lost 24-23, which they nicknamed the burglary between the hedges. All right. We're at Georgia. I think they were ranked number 9 at the time, and I throw a touchdown pass to my good friend who recently passed away a couple years ago, fullback Paige Sessoms, and we throw the touchdown pass with 5 minutes left to tie it 24-24, but our extra point hits the upright. Okay, so it remains 24-23. They get the ball back, we stop them. We get the ball back with under a minute, down 1 point, and we drive them all the way down to Georgia's 19, where we're now in field goal range. But because of the missed extra point, because we weren't sure of the kicker at the time, who was young, I think he was a sophomore only, we call a fade in the end zone. Say, all right, we're going to try a fade to Kenny Clark, and if we get it, we get it. Don't throw a pick. If we get it, we get it. If we don't, we'll come back and kick the field goal. At least try the fade once, because our offense was the strong point of the game, and we were rolling. So I throw the fade in the back of the end zone, and we get called for offensive pass interference. Now, the ball ends up being out of bounds. The players go up for the ball in the end zone, but outside, out of bounds. So it was the infraction that occurred should not have been any defensive or offensive pass interference. It should have been a no call, but they called offensive pass interference on us and backed us up 15 yards. Well, on the next play, I throw a 15-yard out to Tavarius Davis back down to the 19, and they called us for not having enough men on the line of scrimmage. And the film clearly shows that there may be a centimeter of the toe of the foot of the guy that they called it on, but he was clearly on the line of scrimmage. But that backed us up another 10 yards, put us out of field goal range, and we lost the game. So that was now nicknamed, entitled, that game, the burglary between the hedges, because in Georgia you're playing between the hedges. So that game was tough. We weren't mad at the kicker. We weren't, because we were all teammates. We're all brothers. There's a lot of things that can happen during a game that could change the outcome. In the first quarter, the second quarter, if I'd have done that, if I'd have done this, if the kicker would have done that, if the receiver wouldn't have dropped that, if the quarterback didn't overthrow that, there's a lot of things like that happen throughout a game that can change the outcome. But in this particular game is what stands in my mind, because the refs, they took the game from us. They called 2 bogus penalties. And I remember when I was a Gamecock, Coach Reeves always told me, now, we're going to play an SEC school. We're on the road. We're going to have to beat them and the refs. So the SEC officiating was always known to have a little home field advantage, even when I was in the SEC. So when I was at UCF as an independent playing against an SEC school, I look back and said, sure enough, those sons of guns, they called 2 bogus penalties at the end of the game. And even in the referee, the coaches meetings later, the next season, when they all got together, they admitted to blowing the calls. And one of them, I think, even admitted to our coach that there was some home cooking going on there. So that's why they called it the burglary between the hedges, which we should have won that game and upset number 9 ranked Georgia at their home field.
Well, yeah, no doubt some of that home cooking was going on back then, well, not quite pre-internet, but, pre-Twitter and social media. Who knows? But, yeah, back-to-back ticky-tack stuff, we can kind of put it together here, what's going on.
Absolutely. It is what it is. There's not much you can do about it now.
Now, one quote that I think you'll appreciate, this is another quote that I pulled from the Orlando Sentinel after the game. This is from Georgia coach Jim Donnan. There's a lot of teams in our league that would like to have that Central Florida offense. And I would like to think he's speaking specifically about you and your key playmakers.
Well, we had a lot of talent on that team, and especially at the wide receiver position. But I attribute that to Coach Kruzak, because we had a professional offense. Like I mentioned earlier, we were required to audible at the line of scrimmage. He taught us so well, and I knew this from our first meeting with him, that this guy was going to teach me quarterback in a way that I had never been taught before. We were required to change the play at the line of scrimmage. If he called the play and we came up there and they were in a defense that was going to stop that play, we better check out of that immediately. It was very similar to a way that Peyton Manning played the game, where you always Omaha this and changing the play that. Peyton would change that play 17 times at the line of scrimmage, because the defense was always doing different moves, and they're trying to audible up based off his audible. So they were trying to change the play, the defense, based off Peyton's audible. So Coach Cruz really instilled our offense and taught us how to play the game of football in a professional way, and what to look for and what to know pre-snap of the football. so that when the snap of the ball occurred, they would drop into whatever coverage. But we knew what they were going to drop into based off indicators that he would pick out during the week. He would say, look, a lot of times they show cover two and they end up in cover two. But every time that they show cover two and drop to a man to man or drop to a three, it's 42 that gives it away. Look at it. Every time they're in two and they stay in two, he's lined up here. Every time they're in two and they switch to cover three, he's lined up a half a yard to the right. Every time they're in two and they switch to man to man, he's lined a half a card to the left or half a yard forward. It's very small things. So we're able to come up to the line of scrimmage and just look at one guy and know what they were going to do pre-snap. He was very, very good at that. And he started watching the film on the plane home of the following team, or right when he got home, because we didn't have tablets and iPads and those types of things. And everything was VHS back then. But as soon as he got off the plane, he wasn't celebrating or he wasn't worried about the game we just played. He was already scheming for the next game. So that quote by Jim Donnan is, I appreciate very much. I attribute that to Coach Kruzak preparing our offense.
He's a well-respected offensive mind, like you said. Was he a guy that if it's 4th and a half a yard, 4th and inches, would he call for a sneak, or did he ever let you go up there and call a fullback dive or something like that?
He liked to run me. He knew I could run. We ran the option quite a bit, and he'd call quarterback draws. But yeah, he called plenty quarterback sneaks in my day, and I remember I go back now and I forget a lot of the plays during the games, and I'm just amazed at some of the things that we did, because we were only Division One at that time in 1999. I think 4 or 5 seasons. UCF was 1AA, I think, during the early Culpeper years, or right when Culpeper came is when they moved to D1.
And they're not affiliated with a conference. It's an independent school. Did you pause at all, when you were thinking about, when you're considering transferring to UCF, that, okay, if we win 7 or 8 games, we're not going to compete for a conference championship? Was that a...
No, I always looked at it because I grew up a Notre Dame fan. My dad's a Notre Dame grad, so even in Miami, I grew up diehard Notre Dame, who has always been independent. So to me, I was in the same league as Notre Dame in my mind, but not to have a conference game, it never really even crossed my mind. No.
And back then, it wasn't like you just win 6 games and you automatically get a bowl bid.
Right. There weren't as many bowl games as there are now, that's for sure.
The 2000 season, you guys go 7-4, but do not get a bowl invitation. That season, I know it comes with high expectations, and your goal is to get the Golden Knights to AP Top 25, and you got another tough schedule. Take me through, I guess, your thought process. You're coming off that 99 year. There's a lot of attention on Vic Penn. You got to be pretty proud of yourself and the coaching staff's behind you. How was it with just those high expectations and staring down that new schedule?
Well, we opened up at Georgia Tech, and we started off really well in that game, and we played really well in that game. We lost it at the end. There's a couple things that happened in that game that if things would have went one way or the other, the way the ball bounces. But I'll explain it like this. When you go out against the Florida Gators in the second game of the season, the year before I opened up with a touchdown pass on the first drive against Purdue, and I set the bar really high. And when you set the bar really highly like that, you're expected to play at that level every week. And if you fall short of the bar that you set, it's kind of a letdown. Even though you may have played well, you didn't play as well as you did before. So the pressure is really, really tough being in the quarterback position. I think it's one of the hardest positions to play in sports, especially at that high of a level. But the 2000 season started off, we should have beat Georgia Tech. We were the better team. We lost at the end. George Godsey, who I became friends with later on, was the quarterback at Georgia Tech, and he threw 2 late touchdown passes. And he ended up becoming the offensive coordinator at UCF when George O'Leary was their head coach later on. And he and I became friends because I was the president of the Letterman's Club, and we associated quite a bit together. We lost that Georgia Tech game, and I ended up getting hurt a few more games after that, a couple more games after that. And Ryan Snyder came in and was playing really well. He ended up becoming one of UCF's all-time leading passers. He played 4 straight seasons there. And we ended up beating Alabama later on in that year. Alabama, Coach DuBose was their head coach, as you mentioned. It wasn't a Nick Saban, powerhouse, but they were, I think, 6-5 that year. but they were beating us that whole game in the first half. I think it was 24-7 at halftime, Alabama, and they were running the ball down our throats. And then they came out in the second half and started throwing the ball, and nobody understood why, but we didn't care. We picked one for six and it brought the score closer. They came out, they threw again, we intercepted it again, and we got back into the game and ended up winning. But the Alabama head coach, Mike DuBose, got fired 2 hours after that loss. After we beat them, they fired Coach DuBose 2 hours after that game. And I'm telling you, Dan, they were running the ball down our throats. We couldn't stop the run to save our lives. They were up 24-7, I think, at halftime, and they came out throwing, and they blew the game and got us back into it. Where Snyder came and led a great drive at the end. We kicked a field goal to beat them, which if you UCF the kick, you'll see that final kick where Javier Borlegi kicks that game-winning field goal. And I'm so glad he did, because I never anticipated living up here on the Panhandle, where it's Crimson Tide territory, and being in an elevator with somebody and them having an Alabama hat or Roll Tide this and Roll Tide that. And I tell them, you can Roll Tide all you want. I don't care what year it was, we beat that Crimson Tide of Alabama, and that's something that can never be taken from us.
And you really, I mean, I'm sure DuBose was on the hot seat, but one game, Central Florida changes the trajectory of Alabama football. You know, if he makes it through the year, if DuBose coaches through the rest of the year, maybe they don't hire the next guy, and then the next guy, Franchione, I think it was, and then things just.
The coaching staff in Alabama history was altered that game, and we played a part in it. Never really thought of that either.
Now, when you got hurt, I was also doing some reading, and it was one of those things where I kind of leaned back and it made me smile, I guess, because Ryan had some really complimentary things to say about you and really stuck up for you, said Vic's a great quarterback. And I think I actually saw a picture of you guys in the newspaper where it looked like you were probably friends, you know?
To this day, I can call Ryan up and he'll answer my calls, and he calls me up and we talk football. And Ryan, as a freshman, he had never played it down, and I was coming into the season in '99. He redshirted, and he would come up before every game and he would bless my football. He would make this like the cross over the football, and he'd always bless my football. We were great friends off the field. Of course, we competed against each other, in practice, but off the field, we hung out on Friday nights, and he'd come to my apartment and I'd go to his, and we'd hang out. We were always good friends. So yes, I always pull for Ryan, and I watch his career, and to this day, I still say that he was one of the greatest passers that ever played at UCF. And there's been some good ones, but Ryan was a great quarterback, and he's doing really well down there as the head coach of Cocoa Beach High School.
I know that you mentioned on a previous episode, another podcast, that I'm forgetting the name now, but I'll remember. But you were saying that at each stop, whether you're in Kansas, Garden City for that one season, or South Carolina for that one season, and I know this to be true just from my connection with you, that you've picked up a lot of friends along the way, and you don't forget people. When you make a connection, that's one of your buds. Is that one thing you can look back on your football career and say, hey, whatever happened, I've got all these rich friendships with these people that we're going to be friends for life?
Absolutely. Friends for life. And what's really cool, you're absolutely right to answer your question. As a quarterback, I've always tried to be the same way to the starting receiver as I was the walk-on guy that never saw the field but was at practice every day, because people are people, and it's about respect. And the thing that I didn't really understand when I was playing and making the transfers, but now, especially with like Facebook and social media, is that I have a group of brothers at South Carolina, a group of brothers at Miami High, a group of brothers at Southwest, because when you play a season with a team, those guys become your family, your brothers. You're going to quote unquote war with these guys, and are battling in game in and game out. So when you go a season so now in my older years, I have all these networks of people that you don't really realize at the time. But and they always ask me, am I a UCF fan or a South Carolina fan? I always say, well, it depends on who's having a better season. But in reality, you have just this network of South Carolina people that I'm close with, a network of UCF people that I'm close with. The amount of people that it brought me around into, and the experiences that I went through because of it later in life, really to look back, and I'm very thankful for all of that, because like you said, I made a lot of friends. Even in Garden City, Kansas, I still talk daily to some of those guys in Kansas who went on to do their own lives, and are other professionals in other areas. And it's a great network of friends. I'm very thankful for it, which is something I didn't realize as it was happening.
Who is somebody, one of your old friends at any of these stops, who was just the funniest guy? Are there anybody that stands out that just had everybody laughing?
I always got to throw Chris Askew a bone. My friend Chris Askew, he's a fireman down in Orlando. God bless him. I think he has 5 kids, similar to your age. I think they're all 6 and under, 7 and under. So he's just got his hands full down there. He's a paramedic in there, but he was our backup long snapper. And his claim to fame was that he actually dressed and was at the Middle Tennessee State game, because he dressed for home games, but he didn't dress for away games. But they let him come to the Middle Tennessee State game, and that was the game that I set the rushing record on. And so he's the one that always texts me, the quarterback's getting close. He's at 103, those years. And he always listens to the podcasts, and he always says, "Hey, how come you didn't mention me?" So Chris Askew is one of the guys that I always like to mention. He was the backup long snapper. He's a hell of a long snapper. Probably deserved more playing time than he actually got, but he's a good friend of mine, and Chris always stands out in my mind.
That's a good quality, whether it's the long snapper, the punter. I'm sure you talked to the punters, the guys on special teams, or walk-ons, and didn't just stay in one clique of guys.
No.
How about Rico Joseph? How about that guy?
Rico Joseph was a safety for us at UCF, and he had a big role in that Georgia game, and so in a lot of the games. Rico was a tremendous athlete, and I still connect with him on Facebook here today, and tremendous asset to UCF. But I'll tell you what, one of the greatest defensive backs of all time was our teammate at UCF. His name was Dante Samuel, and he played DB for the New England Patriots and for the Philadelphia Eagles. And he, I think, had more interceptions, and it was all pro many, many years. Should be in the Hall of Fame, in my opinion, here eventually. And one of the greatest defensive ends of all time signed with my recruiting class at South Carolina, John Abraham. If you look up John Abraham, he has more sacks NFL now than Lawrence Taylor and Bruce Smith and these guys. I think he had 103 total sacks in his career as an Atlanta Falcon and New York Jet, and some disgusting number of Pro Bowls. And Jonathan Abraham was a good friend of mine in South Carolina. Still talk to him today. And I have a play in one of our spring games where I rolled out, or I dropped back, and he came unblocked, and I was able to scramble around him. And I put that up on Facebook a couple of years ago, because I came across the spring game tape, and I said, here's one of the greatest defensive ends in all time. And I'm telling you, he's got more forced fumbles. He ranks like third in all-time sacks, or something of that nature. I'm ahead of guys like Lawrence Taylor and Bruce Smith and Reggie White and all these guys. And he's a Hall of Fame candidate also, and he should be in the Hall. Yeah, you treat those guys the same way as you treat the walk-on. I was always a holder, so I was always close with special teams. I always was good friends with the kickers and the punters, because I was a holder. I held the extra points and field goals. So those guys are you just look at it from a respect point of view as human being to human being. And I was thankful to be raised by 2 great parents, and just to be able to make friends with everybody on the team, no matter what their role was or what their position was.
It's great to hear that, Vic, and it's not surprising, just my friendship with you, to hear those things. Vic, what about, did you get to call many fake plays, or did Crusette call any fake field goals, fake punts? Did you get to be a part of, like, say, you're the holder?
Well, funny you mentioned that. The first touchdown I ever scored in college was as a Gamecock against Vanderbilt. They called a fake field goal at South Carolina. I was a South Carolina Gamecock, and they called a fake field goal from like the 5 or 7 yard line, and I was able to run it in. And what it was is that the coaches noticed an alignment mix-up on Vanderbilt's special teams, extra points, field goals, and they said, "Look, if we just run the option with Vic as the holder, put the kicker as the running back, as the option guy. All he has to do is read this one guy. If the guy goes to the kicker, Vic runs right in. If the guy comes to Vic, he pitches it to the kicker, and the kicker runs right in. So we called the fake field goal at South Carolina against Vanderbilt, and the option guy ran straight to the kicker, so I was able to run it in for a touchdown. And that was the first collegiate touchdown that I ever scored against Vanderbilt as a Gamecock.
That's great. I've actually got in my notes here 1 rushing touchdown, South Carolina, so that's it. What an exciting play. I'm always watching for fake punts. I mean, they're just so exciting when they happen, especially when when they're not on their own 45 and it's just an unusual situation. I like the direct snap to the halfback sometimes on a fake punt.
Oh, yeah. Kruzak at UCF was very good at scripting a first drive. And our first play of the game very often was usually some kind of a reverse with a pass. We had Tyson Henshaw was one of our receivers, who his brother Darren Henshaw was a quarterback before me at UCF, learned from Kruzak, and is now the offensive coordinator at UCF. But Tyson Henshaw, his younger brother, was our wide receiver who could throw the football. So we opened up a lot of games with like a pitch to the tailback, a reverse to the receiver Tyson, who would end throw the ball downfield to a fullback or somebody that was forgotten about. But we scored on our first drive just about every game because he was so well a coach at scripting a first drive better than anybody I've ever seen, because he'd watch how they come out game after game on their first drive. He knew what defenses they were going to be in, and he was able to script the first drive better than anybody I've ever been around. And we scored 9 out of 10 times on that first drive. And a lot of times he would call a little fake, fake little play, a reverse pass or something of that nature on the first play of the game.
Vic, I know after it's many times as you threw the ball in the 99 season coming into 2000, I remember you saying that ideally you'd like to be maybe throwing 20 times a game as opposed to 40 or 50, but it just the game flow and the opponents and just situations were calling for it.
Yeah, anytime you're playing the quarterback position, you want to throw as little as possible. Anytime you can hand that ball off to a running back and have him, or multiple running backs carry the load, take the pressure off, it makes it that much easier. When you're getting down in a game or your running game's not doing so well and you're forced to pass, defense can really just pin their ears back and blitz you, and you take a lot more hits, and you've got to be on top of your game. But yeah, anytime you can throw the ball about that 20, 25 times a game, that would be ideal for me. But most games, I think I set in 99 the passing attempt record at UCF also. I think it was 455 times. I'm not sure if that record still holds or not, but that's 45 times over 11 games roughly. And it was 455 attempts I had that year, which at the time was a UCF record. I forgot to check to see if that one's still the record. But they say, well, that's just attempts. That doesn't mean anything. I said, yeah, well, it does, because in order to get those attempts, you have to be getting first downs. You go
Right.
3 and out. So you have to make completions in order to get more attempts. So that was one of the records that I left with the UCF was held for a while. I'm not sure if that got broke or not, but again, I only played 16 total games, 17 maybe total games. I got in at the final game against Virginia Tech. Michael Vick, he didn't play that game. He had a hurt ankle, but Schneider got knocked out at the end of the fourth, and I was able to come in. I got a standing ovation from the Citrus Bowl crowd. We played at the Citrus Bowl. UCF now has an on-campus stadium, but when I played, we played at the Citrus Bowl downtown Orlando. It was a good way to go out and to be able to live in Orlando for several years after that and be a part of the Letterman's Club. And when Leary came in and he really revamped that whole program and got that on-campus stadium and watched the quarterbacks year after year, Blake Bortles, Ryan Schneider, McKenzie, and then for the record, the rushing record, which I thought would never be broken, Plumlee came in and broke it last year, and the rest is history.
But your legacy really is solidified with the Golden Knights, and like you said, I think the fan base, the people that have been around a long time, they know who you are. And this episode is really for, again, guys our age that may have forgotten some of those games and the games that you were a part of. And I want them to say, "Oh yeah, I remember Vic Penn," and to go check out the highlights. And then for the young kids that you're only watching stuff going back to maybe 2016, dial it back a little ways. I mean, we didn't have flat screen TVs in the 90s yet, but there's some great game action. And if you're a young quarterback, you're also really interested in teaching the things that you picked up along the way to younger athletes and helping them be successful.
Yep. During COVID, during the lockdown, I started virtual QB training, and I was able to actually train a few quarterbacks, and I trained one specifically out in Iowa. His father contacted me, and I trained him virtually. And he would send me, I would tell him, look, I need to see a three-step drop to the left, a three-step drop to the right, a five to the left, a five to the right, a couple of rollouts. And I would have them send me specific videos that I would request, and then I would critique them and make them videos of how to do it. I would say, because each quarterback was different, I would say, look, this is what you're doing wrong. You're good on this, but your ball's too low. You got to hold it up higher. You got it too high. You're taking too long of a hitch step there, things of that nature. But then what it turned out is that they would send me the game tape, and they have this thing called Huddle now, where you can all of the games are right there at your fingertips. So, but I was really able to help the quarterback very well. He was only in 10th grade, and I trained him for an entire season. And then he went out and became an all-time high school leader in three-pointer basketball after that season. I don't even think he played football the next year, which is smart. He stuck with basketball, but it was a very interesting concept, and it was about training the mind of the quarterback, excuse me. And I was teaching them things that were taught to me by some great quarterback coaches, and I wanted to give back, and it really paid off. It really helped a few quarterbacks, and it was a blessing, and it got me back into the game a little bit, and I was able to give back and train a few quarterbacks.
And Vic, as your college career is winding down, you're obviously exploring some options, and you compete in the new AF2. Take me through just some of those, some of those seasons, some of the guys that you met or experiences.
Well, out of college, I signed a contract with the BC Lions in the Canadian Football League. And Marcus Allen's brother, Damon Allen, was the starting quarterback. They had just won the Grey Cup, which is the Super Bowl for Canadian leagues. So I played in the CFL. From that, I went to the Arena Football Leagues. I played with the Arena 2 League for a couple of years, and the Arena League for a year. I was an Orlando Predator for a year, and I learned from Jay Gruden, who is the younger brother of John Gruden, who's obviously a Super Bowl champion coach. And Jay Gruden has coached some in the NFL also, and I was able to learn from him. Also, the arena game was tremendous, a lot of fun, because you're throwing every down, and you got a wide receiver coming full speed in motion towards the line of scrimmage at the snap of the ball, and you're throwing 6, 7, 8 touchdowns a game, and really high scoring games. That was a lot of fun. It was indoors, shorter fields, walls on the side of the field where there's no out of bounds, so you can't run out of bounds on arena ball. You get smacked into the wall. But I played a couple seasons there, met a lot of great friends, and it was a great experience.
And got to make an impact on, more teammates and maybe the fans that go to these games. I went to some Arena League games when I was younger, but if you're a little kid, you get to see these guys really up close.
Oh yeah, I always look back, put myself in the shoes of a young kid, and I remember how I was at football games. So anytime I could give a wristband or a towel or something that I was allowed to give away, I always made sure I gave it all away to the fans and the kids that were there at the games, because I knew how much it meant to them, because I know how much it meant to me when I was their age. And my younger brother, he's 32 now, but he was 13 when I was I was 13 when he was born. So when I was 18, 19, and 20 playing college football at a high level, he was 5, 6, 7 years old. So I was able to get him down to the fields, and there was one incident, not incident, but one memory where I got him down in the field, and he's over there, and all the cheerleaders are I think it was the Gators. He's, so now that he's 32 years old, you've met Joe, Joe. So
Oh yeah, great guy.
I always say, hey, I need, can you shoot me $20, or can you, hey, I need a favor. Remember that time when I got you on the field with those cheerleaders at the game? And he says he got there down on his own, but we joke around that now that he's older. But being at that close level and in the Arena League really was a difference. But I always remember bringing my little brother Joe, who was like 5 or 6 at the time. His brother's playing against the Gators. It was just a big thing for him, at that young of an age. So when you see Joe, make sure you remind him of that.
Absolutely. I mean, he really must have thought that you were larger than life. I mean, you're his brother, and he sees you out of uniform. But what a special memory there.
Joe's great. I love Joe. He's my little brother, and you know Joe.
Yeah, the three of us have gotten to hang out, go to a ball game together, and I've got brothers as well. So when it was me hanging out with the two of you, I really appreciated the bond that you two had. It showed me that you, as the older brother, had put in the time with him to be a positive influence. And yeah, I really liked your connection with your brother because that's important to me as well.
Yep, and we got to get back and go to a couple of those Pensacola Wahoos games when we get a chance.
Absolutely. I cannot believe it's been as long as it has been.
I know time flies. It's crazy.
I say this a lot on the podcast, but I really mean this, Vic. We may have to do a part two. I don't know. There's just
Sure.
I mean, you played against the best of the best. I mean, just to be able to have that moment with Drew Brees and take some of those hits. I mean, my gosh, Marcus Stroud, I think for Georgia. I mean, that was no walk in the park to have him barreling down on you.
No doubt, Marcus Stroud. I remember Javon Curse for the Gators, or they nicknamed the Freak. Played against a lot of great defensive ends, and a lot of those guys. I think Marcus Stroud. There's a picture of me that I actually think was on USA Today. The cover of the sports section of USA Today was Marcus Stroud sacking me. Yeah, to play against some of the athletes that I played against, not just at the quarterback position, but all the positions. It was a tremendous experience.
Well, Vic, I usually ask some questions here at the end that are just oddball questions. Do you have a favorite sports movie of all time?
All right,
My
yeah.
favorite sports movie of all time, I think, would have to be the movie Rudy. Again, I grew up a Notre Dame fan, and I still get goosebumps and maybe a little tear in my eye when he gets that sack at the end. I was, a diehard Notre Dame fan. My dad was Notre Dame grad, so I grew up just a diehard Notre Dame fan in the city of Miami, which hated Notre Dame, back in the day. So that's probably my favorite sports movie.
And since we're the same age, do you like Netflix and all the stuff that we can just watch and stream movies, or do you sometimes miss Blockbuster Video and going to the theater? I know we can still go to the theater, but do you miss some of that stuff?
Yeah, I used to be pretty active in Netflix. I haven't in a few years. Since COVID, everything kind of got thrown out of whack, and been focusing on my business and that. So I haven't really hit Netflix that hard. But I was just talking to my dad the other day. We were sitting out there in front of a store, and there was one of those red box machines, where people go up and rent movies, and how we used to go to Blockbuster Video and hope that our favorite movie wasn't rented out yet, and hope that when we did get it, it was rewound in the beginning.
That's right. Kids don't really, kids these days, they don't know what it's like to, like you said, go to the video store and then you see that wall of empty, or just the front boxes, but there's no, there's no cassette there.
You have to go check the recent returns, and hopefully somebody just returned it.
As a kid, were there teams that you liked? I know you liked the Dolphins and Dan Marino, but were there any teams that you liked based solely on their uniforms? Like you just loved the uniforms?
Notre Dame. I was diehard Notre Dame. I don't care what they would come out in those green jerseys every now and again. I loved it. I would sometimes be brought to tears at like 10 years old if Notre Dame would lose, especially if they lost to the Hurricanes, because late 80s, early 90s, Miami Hurricanes had great football then too. And those Notre Dame Miami games were always huge, especially when I went to school with every Hurricane fan in town or my best friends. But here I am with my Notre Dame shirt, in fifth or sixth grade, and if they would lose, I couldn't take it. It would ruin my day. So I was just a diehard Notre Dame fan, a diehard Dolphin fan too, but probably more so Notre Dame than Miami Dolphins.
And going back to your high school playing days, and like you said, you're in an environment where there's not a lot of guys like you, and you stand out. How long did it take to win over those locker rooms, or all of a sudden you're on the bus and you're cutting up with a couple guys, or did they? Did
Well,
your
when I transferred to Miami High, that was probably the hardest because I was, going to a school that was 50% Hispanic, 48% African American, 2% other. It was me and the Chinese kid.
other?
There wasn't a white category, but I but so it took me a while to earn the respect of those guys. But once I did, they're still friends to these days. I still talk to many of them at both schools. At my first school, Southwest High School, which was my childhood friends, and then I had to end up playing against them twice at Miami High. I had to go head to head with them. We won both games, but I remember hanging out with them the week before or the week during the game and saying, "Look, I got to play you, tomorrow night." My best friend Donnie March, who was the defensive end for Southwest High School, and I had to play against them. They played us tough. We ended up winning 14-7. We were blowing everybody out, and they played us tough. But he sacked me that game. He pushed me out of bounds, but it was a yard behind the line of scrimmage. I was rolling out right, and everybody was. I should have thrown it away, but Donnie came and he kind of pushed me a little as I stepped out of bounds, and it was 1 yard behind the line of scrimmage. So he actually sacked me, and he's somebody that's been my best friend since 9, 10 years old. Being the quarterback and being a leader, you're respectful, and just being the way that I was raised and person that I am, and thankful to my parents and my relationship with God and my spiritual life. It wasn't too hard for me to earn the respect. Plus, I could throw the ball like Dan.
Old Dan. Did you ever get a chance to meet Marino? I know he's not the easiest guy to get to, but any.
No, I saw him at a camp that my dad took me to, and he was there, but he had a mob of people around him, so I never really got up there to meet him. But I did stand pretty close to him and watched him, and he was definitely my childhood quarterback hero, and I emulated everything that he did, to include that quick release, which is what really got me the scholarship.
Vic, was there, if you had to play on the other side of the ball, if you had to play a defensive position, is there one that you maybe it just wouldn't work size wise, but a position on defense that you would like to play?
I would have played free safety. I probably would have been a good corner, but these guys are so tremendously talented. I would have been better at as a free safety to be able to read the quarterback's eyes and anticipate plays, and I think I would have made a good free safety if I played defense.
Well, all right, couple wacky questions and we'll wrap up here. If you could be one of these two animals for just one day and just live their life, would you rather be a bird or a fish?
Definitely a bird. I think I have a better chance of survival as a bird. If I was a fish, I could get walloped in any second, or it could be used for bait, or even if I got off the hook and hit the dock and fell into the water, I get eaten again. So um, bird might be my best chance of survival. So I would probably choose a bird.
If you had to participate in a food eating contest, would you do a hot dog eating contest or pie?
I remember the movie Stand by Me and what happened to him after eating all that pie. So I'd probably have to say hot dogs.
Well, Vic, this has just been awesome. I mean, if you're on YouTube, Vic, is this right? You just plug in Vic Penn.
It's all the highlights, and that's
In
the
the ver-
best way to see the highlights in the games is on YouTube. Absolutely.
And the virtual QB training website is still up.
and the
virtualqbtraining.com. virtualqbtraining.com.
All right. Well, hey, Vic, anything that you'd like to plug? Is there anything that you're jamming to music-wise or
You have 3 kids now, so you can relate to this. Once I became a dad, I stopped being cool. I don't really keep up too much with the good songs of today, because when I became a dad, I stopped being cool. So my son's 17 now, and so it goes through phases, as you'll see. There'll be especially when not only the music, but the Nickelodeon shows and the kids shows that they watch. They go through the Lego phase, then it's the Mighty Machine phase, and then then it turns into the gaming phase, and you'll see how those phases go by. But always remember this: hold your kids as often as you can, and carrying them as often as you can, because there'll come a time where you can't carry them anymore. And so cherish those times. If they want to be let down, I always say hold them as long as you can, because at some point they're going to be too big to hold, and they're going to walk the rest of their lives, and you won't be able to hold them anymore. So hold those kids as much as you can.
that's some great advice, Vic, and it reminds me of when you and I when our our paths crossed, and I was still about, say, 6 or 7, maybe 8 years away from my first boy. But I knew deep down that I wanted to be a dad, and I loved just hearing you talk about your little boy at that time,
Yes.
which he would have been somewhere between 5, 6, 7.
Yeah, he was 5 or 6, I think, when you and I first met. He's 17 now, so it goes by fast. And I know the cliche is they grow up fast, but boy, do they grow up fast. Seems like yesterday he was just born, and man, he's about to be a senior in high school. He is a senior in high school.
And guys, especially listening, a big part of this podcast is I want men to be men, and there's different ways. It's not all. I mean, masculinity is sometimes you can look at it one dimensionally, but a lot of that is if you're a dad, be a dad. If you can't be there every day for your kids for certain situations, do the best you can because Vic, going back to the very start of this episode, you said that your dad's involvement in your life, spending time with you and your brothers,
No
was
doubt.
probably a big turning point for you. It's like if you take him out of the picture completely during those years.
I wouldn't be the person that I am today without my dad. To this day, he's still, he's 76 years old. I've worked with him as a business partner too for the last 15, 16 years. But to this day, if there's an issue, if I need something, it's dad. I'm calling dad. He's been my guy. So I admire what you just said there, and it's right. He was always been my dad. He's always been there, and I try to be the same way to my son.
Great stuff, Vic. Well, I love you, brother.
Love you too, Dan.
Thanks for coming on the show. Okay. Well, guys, thanks for listening today. And remember, if you're getting that update on your laptop and you've been clicking X on it and it says to update this or that or your malware software, it's time to run that thing. Take the 3 or 4 minutes to just deal with it and, and save yourself the headache. And remember, if you're looking to improve your game or you just want to go back and check out some of the great quarterbacks of the past quarter century, do yourself a favor and check out some of those old highlights. All right, guys, that's been it for this episode of Dan Time. You have a great week. Go out there and make a difference in somebody's life.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Vic. Hey, if you like that episode and you're really enjoying the show, please take a minute to leave a 5-star rating for the Dan Time podcast. I'd really appreciate if you download and subscribe. And to keep up with Dan Time throughout the week, you can follow any one of our social media pages. There's @DanTimePod on Twitter/X, DanTimePod on Instagram, and the Dan Time Podcast also has a Facebook page. Check us out on YouTube. That's where you can find all the Friday Challenge videos in every episode. Thanks again, everybody. We'll see you next week.